Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Midland Cultural Centre, and welcome to A Day in the Life. Now, here is the host of A Day in the Life, Fred Hacker.
This is program number 127 in this series of A Day in the Life programs. And we've had some fabulous guests, and we're delighted to have yet another one tonight. The program is made possible by two types of sponsorship. We have a sponsor for the whole season, and that is our friends Kathy Bales, Michelle Dishaw, and Jeff Holloway. They are portfolio managers at RBC Dominion Securities. They provide wealth management services and strategic advice to their clients. We also have a show sponsor each night, and our show sponsor tonight is Greg Rice. And I would ask Greg to stand up, and in a moment I'm going to ask Jeff Holloway to stand up, but Greg's not here, so I just wanted to explain to you, he's actually helping his father close out their cottage because they sold the cottage. So Greg regrets being here and asked me to say hi to everyone. But Jeff, are you here? Jeff Holloway from RBC? Oh, right up here, great. Jeff, thanks very much for your sponsorship. Delighted that you're with us. Well, without further ado, I would like to welcome a guy who I have had a lot of fun with preparing for this program. This is a very funny man. Would you please join me in welcoming Terry Fallis? Welcome.
Nice to be here. Thank you all for coming in such numbers. We Canadian novelists are unaccustomed to audiences of quite this size. So this is lovely.
I realized that I made a grammatical mistake in introducing you. Did you catch it?
I did, but I was not going to say anything.
Thank you. What was it? Yeah. That's our secret. So Terry, what we like to do with this program is through guests like you who had very successful careers, and in your case at least 3 different successful careers, talk about the kinds of things that inspired you, that the events, the people, the circumstances that sort of led to your getting into the various jobs that you've done, and now your very successful career as an author. So let's start at the very beginning. When and where were you born, Terry?
I was born at the tail end of the 50s, December 23rd, 1959, in Toronto. So I was born and raised in Toronto. Not many have spent almost their entire life in Toronto.
Right.
But I've been there, save for a few years in Ottawa and in Hamilton at university.
Right. You have really interesting parents. And I'd like to ask you to just tell us quickly about your mom, sort of what she was like, and what influence she had on your development.
Well, my mother, who has passed away in the early 2000s, she was a nurse and just an extraordinary woman. I mean, my father was extraordinary too, but my mother, I think, earns as many accolades as my father does, just for being who she was. She was very kind, always concerned about other people. If someone moved into the neighborhood, 24 hours later, she'd be over with a casserole or something to welcome them to the neighborhood. And, so she was a nurse. She met my father at the Toronto General Hospital, and she sort of was at home with us, and then raised us in a way at home, and then went back to nursing thereafter.
Good for her.
And I think she instilled with us a real sense of how important kindness was or is in the world, and that we need to incorporate that into our life and be good to people, and be nice to people. And she also schooled us in manners and etiquette, and I can tell you what side of the sidewalk I'm supposed to walk on when I'm walking with my wife.
Good.
All of those things she sort of drilled into us.
I'm from that generation too.
And they've stayed with me.
Yeah. People wonder what I'm doing when I scurry to the outside of the sidewalk.
Exactly. What was that about?
Yeah, exactly.
We know.
Yeah. Tell us about your dad. I have
Well,
a
my
picture
dad was
of him,
just
actually.
about as tall as you are. My dad was 6'6". He was a physician, a pediatric surgeon. He was the first director of the emergency department at the Hospital for Sick Children. And he was one of the main instigators of the air ambulance service in Toronto, in Ontario, when it started in the very late 70s, I'd say.
There's a big screen behind us that has the same picture as we're looking at here.
Yeah, that's a good shot of my dad, actually. He passed away a couple of years ago now, but that's at the cottage, and you see the binoculars around his neck there. He was an avid birder, as was my mother, and they would sort of travel the province and the country and sometimes other countries.
He also had a sense of humor.
He was a very funny guy, a parched sense of humor.
Okay.
And I think part of where my sense of humor comes from is competing with my twin brother, not to jump ahead,
Yes.
at Sunday dinners to try and get my father to laugh.
Okay.
And because he had a very high laughter threshold, but he had a tell. You know, in poker, you have a tell.
Yes.
He had a little muscle on the side here of his cheek that would just start to vibrate almost imperceptibly. And when we saw that, we could just go in for the kill. But very funny, and also a great lover of language. And he instilled.
He was also a writer, was he not?
He was. He wrote lots of medical books. He also wrote kind of a memoir about his experience as a camp doctor. Which was very funny, and I don't think it sold many copies, but he was a lover of language, and he engendered in all of his offspring an appreciation and a respect, even a reverence for the language and its proper usage.
And you just exhibited that in the answer.
If you happen to use the word fulsome incorrectly tonight, I may have to.
Yes.
I'll sit on my hands, Fred.
I do know what it means. I know what it means because I've used it incorrectly. Yeah.
Most people use it incorrectly.
Yes.
But homework for later, you can look up the word fulsome.
Yeah. They think it has something to do with full.
Well, that's what most people think.
Yeah,
yes.
Exactly. Now, is this two pictures of you at different eras in your life?
Yeah, that's what it looks like, isn't it?
It does.
That is my identical twin brother, Tim. So I'm the younger one, which ought to be obvious from the photograph, I
Yes,
think.
clearly you're on the right.
I'm 8 minutes his junior. So, you know, I always had a roommate growing up. I never had my own room. And we were very close then. We remain very close now. I talk to him every day.
Oh, that's great.
He lives about a 5-minute drive from where I live.
Wonderful. And what has he chosen as a career?
He's in prison right now, actually. He's a.
You did say he was your accomplice.
He has his own promotions and marketing agency called Black Rock Marketing Group, and he's been doing that for well over 20 years and doing quite well. And
great.
So yeah, good guy.
And there is a female in the family,
my
another
sister
female.
Susan. She's 4 years our junior, and she did a master's in speech pathology, communicative disorders, and is married to a doctor in Port Perry, and they have 3 beautiful daughters. So we're very close with them, and we share the family cottage. The 3 siblings share the cottage. Yeah.
Wonderful. Now, you also had a younger brother who died tragically.
I did. David was 8 years our junior. My parents called him their centennial project. He was born in '67. And regrettably, when he was 19, away at Carleton University, only a few weeks into his first year at Carleton, he was killed in a car accident.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, it was tough, but most of us in the room have gone through something like that. I think it's just what happens, and you move on and recover, but never forget.
While we're talking about him, I might just ask our audience, does anyone recognize the name David Stewart? David Stewart Fallis was the brother, do you know? Have any of you read the book Up and Down? Who's the lead character? David Stewart.
Right.
Yeah.
That was my quiet tribute to my
Wonderful.
my younger brother.
Wonderful. And we'll probably find some other things in your life, Terry, that show up in your books.
I think you will.
Yeah. I want to just touch briefly on your elementary school because you took a couple of options that intrigued me.
That's right. When I was in grade 8, I took boys cooking, which, you know, I've written about that. I have a column in a local newspaper in Toronto, and I've written about my escapades in boys cooking and the rodeo stuffed hot dogs and the fire. But I am quite an accomplished cook, I say immodestly.
Yes.
But I thought, my mother always thought it was important that we learn how to cook. And we actually had a day each week. Each child had a day of the week that we were responsible for cooking dinner.
Wonderful.
So I still cook a lot, and my younger son is a chef. And the other option I took was boys golf. Who knew you could take golf in school? But
Get a credit for it, even.
Exactly. So that started my incredibly stellar career in golf. But were it not for taking golf in grade 8, I probably wouldn't have written the novel Albatross, which has some golf in it, as some of you may know.
It's a major focus.
Yeah.
Now, outside school, you did some interesting things. One of the things you did was to play hockey.
Big hockey player. I still play hockey.
Good for you.
Still play hockey, ball hockey now, so it's a better workout. There's no gliding in ball hockey. It's all cardio.
Yeah.
So I do that every Tuesday night. But back in this is either like 69 or 1970. I'm in the front. If you click again, I think there may be some, oh no, I guess there's not. Sorry, I thought there might have been some circles coming up. That's in my presentation, not in yours. But I'm on the far, that side over there.
Okay.
And my twin brother Tim is on the other side. They always put us as far away as possible in the photograph so as not to confuse people.
Yeah. So you could easily identify.
Exactly.
I'm on one end and he's on the
Exactly.
other. Now, there's also another character in this picture, and I'm going to engage our audience for a moment. Back row left. Anybody know who that is? No? Everyone in this room knows this person.
Give us a clue.
Give you a clue?
Yeah.
He was the Prime Minister of Canada? Yeah.
I heard it.
Who said that?
Stephen Harper.
Well done.
Stephen Harper is the blonde in the back row.
That is the Right
Yeah.
Honorable Stephen Harper. Even back then, he was a dedicated right-winger. He was also strong on defense. You couldn't expect someone like me to pass up that
I was going
low-hanging
to say,
fruit.
spoken like a true liberal, Terry. Yeah, good for you. Now, you also had a friend who was a co-conspirator with you in some really interesting ventures.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about one of those?
Sure. I had a pal in school named Jeff Elmer, who's sadly passed away now, but we were classmates. We were both fascinated by things that flew, flying machines and rockets and space and you name it. And when we were in grade 8, I was 12 at the time, we decided hang gliding was the new rage. Hang gliding as a sport had just sort of emerged on the scene, and we decided that we wanted to design and build and, of course, fly a full-sized hang glider. The Falcon series, Falcon 1, 2, and 3. Yes,
Wow.
there were 3 of them.
Wow. And they all flew?
Oh, no. They were about as airworthy as an anvil, but we had a lot of fun doing it. And my parents almost certainly knew that they were not going to get off the ground.
And probably grateful for that.
And perhaps grateful for it. In fact, my mother, I think you have a photo. My mother is actually, you can see her in the photo. But
Oh,
yes, there I am. That's Falcon 2.
and you're the person in the center of the picture.
We call it the pilot.
The
Yes.
pilot, yes. Now, there are some features in this picture that would be nice if we could enlarge, but
Yes,
what do you have in your head?
I have that's my Cooper hockey helmet and mouth guard. Well, falling from 5,000 feet,
Yeah.
you wanted to have some head protection. But speaking of the unbridled optimism of youth, if you look really closely, you can probably see it. There's a piece of rope that's coming down from one handle by my hand and looping behind me and coming back up and connecting to the other handle Believe it or not, I was telling Fred this earlier, believe it or not, that was a sling seat.
For when you got tired.
For when I'm flying around up there. I was worried I was going to get tired hanging onto this thing, so I had this sling seat that I could rest my weary rump in while I was soaring. So that's a photo taken by the photographer of the East York Board of Education. He was not able to get any shots of it when it was flying.
Oh, that's great. Now you attended Leaside
High School.
And the second most famous Canadian author also attended that school.
Second most, yeah. Margaret Atwood attended Leaside High School, and she and I have talked about that often. She was not a fan of the English department at Leaside, though I fared quite well in English.
Did you? Good.
I did. But yes, it was a very good school, and it was literally a 60-second sprint from my front door.
Wow.
I tested that one day when it was raining.
Good for you. Now, you ran for political office there. How did that turn out?
Not so well, Fred. Not so well. My twin brother and I ran on a ticket for president and vice president of the student council. I think we came third out of I think there were 5 candidates. So we did okay.
Yeah,
we did
middle of the pack. Yeah.
But it was fun. It was perhaps my first foray into politics that might have been a harbinger of things to come.
And you also had some musical aspirations in your later secondary school years.
Yeah, when I was 17, just starting grade 13, a good friend taught me how to play guitar, and I got my first guitar. And I have been playing guitar and writing songs and singing in the privacy of my bathroom for all of those years since. I played in a band in university, and any of you who may be familiar with the band The Sky Diggers, anyone? No? We aren't the Sky Diggers, but the lead singer in our band at university went on to found the Sky Diggers, and
wow.
They remain a cult band in Canada. So we like to think we gave him his start. Andy Mays was his name.
You apparently don't have any cultures.
Yeah, maybe not. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. You also pursued your interest in getting off the ground.
Yes.
Tell us about that.
Well, given that the hang gliders didn't really get off the ground, we decided we would try to fly a little closer to the ground. And the same co-conspirator, Jeff, who is the guy huddled or on his haunches in the top right of the photo, that's Jeff.
Just watching.
Yeah, he was just watching. Well, I lost the toss, so I had to test it. But when we were 15, and not yet old enough to drive a car, we spent a year designing and building a full-sized hovercraft. And those of you who read either of my first 2 novels,
yes.
Now you know why there are hovercrafts in those first 2 novels. Described in excruciating detail. My apologies. I didn't really know what I was doing, but I knew that much about hovercrafts.
And there's certainly no reason to keep it in.
No, exactly.
Share it. Share what you know.
Why be concerned about the audience, the reader's interest in this? That's right.
Now, is this vehicle moving?
Yes, that is at the Ontario Science Centre parking lot. It was on display and stored there for a number of years thereafter, but I am flying it there. It was a rather small air cushion, but I'm a good 6 inches off the ground there. There's a lift engine at the front of the craft, which you may be able to see. Stop me if I'm geeking out on hovercraft here. And at the back, there's a twin-cylinder snowmobile engine that's pushing it forward.
Okay. And what was this invention called?
Well, you have to have a name for these things.
Sure.
So this was the GTH-1, the Jeff and Terry Hovercraft 1.
One in a series of...
One. We didn't know it. Actually, we did build a second one, more of an experimental version, but it didn't work quite as well. But this was probably the seminal experience that pushed me into what I studied at university.
Now, I just want to ask our audience, has anybody read the first 2 books that Terry wrote? So you know about the hovercraft. Yes.
You could probably build one from the description in the novel.
And the importance of that hovercraft in the evolution of Canadian democracy.
Indeed.
Yes, yes. Let's talk about university, because you and I share an undergraduate university.
We do. I went to McMaster University. McMaster, I confess, was not my first choice. I also applied to University of Toronto and Queen's, and I did not get into engineering at either of those institutions, for which I'm eternally grateful, because McMaster was the perfect place for me, and it was a university that changed my life, but not just through academics. In fact, actually unrelated to academics. But I did my engineering degree at McMaster, and it took me 6 years before I left. I graduated after my 5th year, but I had been wrapped up in student politics, and so I didn't fail any courses. I wasn't delayed because I was not academically proficient enough, though I confess also that I did pass every year in the top 3/4 of my class. But I made it.
Good.
I made it. But I was very heavily involved in student politics too.
Well, tell us a little about that.
Well, I think it was in my 3rd year. I served on the Student Representative Assembly. I then ran to be vice president of the Students' Union, which was a part-time job. That's what required me to take only half my course load and delay my graduation by at least 1 year. Then I was Speaker of the Assembly for the next year, my 5th year, sorry. And then I ran for president. So I spent my 6th year already having my iron ring, graduated already,
Yeah.
and then I spent the next year as president of the Students' Union, which was a full-time job, and introduced me to the student movement, and I was very active in the national and provincial student movement, and I really cut my teeth in social justice issues, particularly feminism, gender equality, racism, and in the student movement there's a group that will handle any social justice cause. You can get involved in any campaign under the sun if you're active in the student movement, and I did.
My experience at McMaster in student government was that the issues really didn't need to have any local or relevant association with anybody in the student body. I mean, we were very upset about the grape pickers in California.
Absolutely, and I know you're not joking.
No, I'm not.
Yeah,
No.
and we passed motions at our assembly about the contra funding to the rebels
Sure.
in Nicaragua.
Yeah.
Absolutely no bearing on. I mean, it was sort of there was a group on campus who thought, look, let's keep focused on student issues. But my view is, when you're young and you're learning about the world, you're learning how to think critically at university, it's almost the only time in your whole life when you can get involved in issues outside your own borders. And you know, I embraced that, and lots of other kids did too.
Now, Terry, with this iron ring and the substantial commitment of time and obviously money, tell us about your engineering career.
Yeah, my engineering career. It lasted absolutely 0 minutes. I haven't practiced engineering for even one instant in my life, in the formal sense of the word. Having said that, I have no regrets at all about doing an engineering degree. I think it's a great degree to have. It certainly engendered in me a sense of discipline and a work ethic. You can't get through engineering without discipline and a work ethic. It also, I think, gave me a sort of a methodological approach to problem solving, and almost a scientific method that I apply to almost everything I've done in my life, none of which has been engineering. So I continue to view the world through an engineer's lens, and I write my novels, and I know we'll come to that, so I won't scoop ourselves now, but I write my novels the way you would expect a mechanical engineering graduate to write novels.
Great. Now, we can't leave your prestigious engineering career without acknowledging that in 2014, you received the L.W. Schemmelt Distinguished Engineering Alumni Award from McMaster.
And I must have had very few engineers up for that year, but I did. It was a great honor, and Les Schemmelt was the Dean of Engineering, and he was a lovely guy. He's passed away now, but a lovely guy, and he apparently was a fan of my books. I don't know if that was related to the award. I don't think he's involved in deciding who gets the award, believe it or not. They have a committee, but I think in a way this was McMaster's way of saying that engineers do many things in the world, and sometimes they don't practice engineering. So I remember saying in my acceptance speech at the event that it was very brave of them to give a non-practicing engineer this Distinguished Engineering Alumni Award. But I was grateful, and it was a great evening.
Yeah, good for you. Let's turn to your real professional career then. You began your career in politics. Tell us what drew you to that and how you were involved.
I think I knew by the time I was in third year at McMaster that I wasn't going to be a practicing engineer. My interest in politics had kind of overtaken my interest in engineering, though I was still interested and fascinated by both. But when you have 3 years under your belt, I was going to finish it. And I did, and as I said, I have no regrets. But my interest in politics was growing, and my work in the National Student Movement fueled that. And I landed a job. I interviewed for it while I was still president of the Students' Union, my last week, I think it was. And I landed a job, my first job out of university, not an engineering job, was on Jean Chretien's leadership campaign in 1984.
Now, I do have a picture of you. This is when you were student council
Oh, that
president.
was president, yes.
Yeah.
That's when I was president. That's my office.
Right.
I remember that.
And this is you wearing a Chretien shirt.
That was at the Ottawa Civic Centre at the convention.
Wow.
Back when my hair was thicker and I was thinner. I seem to have suffered a reversal in fortunes on both fronts in the intervening years. And you can see the campaign spared no expense on technology as I donned my 1920s Bell Canada headset.
I was actually going to comment to the audience that many people may not know that if you get to wear a headset, you're among the
You're
elite.
a player.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Headset means important.
That's it was so much fun, and we were so committed to Chretien winning that campaign. And I was responsible for that whole swath of people in the Civic Center. That was my quadrant of the arena. And that was my baptism of fire in federal politics. The only other federal politics I'd been involved in was when I was a kid, trailing my father around door to door, canvassing for the local Conservative candidate. Don't tell any of my Liberal colleagues that, please, Fred.
So your father had good taste.
Well, I think they changed their tune later on after much browbeating from me. But yes, they were quite conservative, and we had a conservative sign on our lawn for most of my childhood.
Yeah.
Elections or not.
Now, you did, after the campaign was over, you moved into another position.
Yeah, I came back to Toronto, and I was still drying my tears because Chretien, as you may recall, did not win the 84 campaign.
Yeah.
John Turner won that and immediately became Prime Minister, and he was about to call an election. But he had a problem. He had a fractured party on his hands. Bruising leadership campaigns have a way of dividing parties in various ways. And he wanted the party united. And he did a smart thing. He plucked a couple of people from each of the other competing leadership camps to come to Ottawa to join the government to work on the campaign. And I got a phone call one morning, 2 or 3 days after the leadership campaign, and I was invited to come back to Ottawa. And 24 hours later, I moved to Ottawa and I joined the staff of the Turner's Minister of State for Youth, because I had come out of the student movement. So I was technically, my business card said, policy advisor.
And this was
I was 24 and he was 28.
John LePere. Yeah.
Jean Lapierre. He was
Yeah.
the youngest minister at the time in the
Right.
history of the country.
Yeah.
So that was a wonderful experience working with him on the campaign. We traveled the country. I wrote for him speeches and policy papers. And we took a beating in that campaign. I'm sure you will remember that. The Mulroney
but
rout.
Jean Lapierre actually was one of the 40 liberals.
He was one of the
survived.
lucky 40. I
Yeah.
use the word lucky somewhat advisedly. I'm not sure he considered it lucky, but yeah, he won, and he became international trade critic, opposition critic for international trade, and that was, of course, when the Mulroney Tories were about to start the free trade talks with the United States.
Right.
So I learned a whole new policy area, which
Yeah.
was fascinating, and had a great time with him, writing again for him, preparing questions for him for the House, and it was pretty well a unilingual francophone office. Only Jean Lapierre, my boss, and I spoke English.
Interesting.
And my French got much better,
I'm sure.
which is not saying very much.
To allow you to not have to say it, I'll add to this little story that yes, the Liberals were reduced to 40 seats in 1984, and in 1993, when your friend Jean Chretien won the election, Conservatives were reduced to 3 members of Parliament.
I remember.
Yeah.
I remember. I thought it was 2, actually.
Yeah, I think you're right.
I think it was-
Yeah, Jean Chretien.
Not that I'm counting or anything.
No. Well, they weren't. Now, you then were invited by Jean Chretien to assume how did that come about?
Well, it's funny. I was at a reception in Centre Block on Parliament Hill, and Jean Chretien was there, and we'd worked together in the year before in the leadership campaign, and I remember him. He saw me across the crowded room.
And ran towards you in slow
But
motion.
he said, and you can just picture him saying this, he just said, Terry, walk with me. And when Jean Chretien says, walk with you, you walk with him.
Mm-hmm.
And we left the reception, and we walked down Wellington Street and turned south on Elgin Street, just walking together, and all the shopkeepers would come out when they saw him on the way home. He lived down Elgin Street and over on the other side of the canal. And they would greet him, and he would shake their hands, and he asked me to be his chief of staff.
Wow.
And it was unfortunate that I said no. I could barely bring myself to say no, but I had accepted. I mean, we ended up at his house, and that's where he asked me. And Aline, his wife, brought in the photograph that was to grace the cover of his book, Straight from the Heart.
Oh, yes.
And he claimed I was the first outsider to see the cover of the book. So I've got that on my LinkedIn profile, I think. No, I don't. But I had just the week before accepted a new job, but it just wasn't broadly known yet. But that was around the same time when David Peterson came to power after 42 years
In
of
Ontario.
Conservative rule in Ontario.
Yeah.
And I was invited to return to Toronto and be at Queen's Park on the political staff of the finance minister, then called the Ontario Treasurer, if you remember back in those days. And Bob Nixon, former leader of the Liberal Party, was the treasurer, and I was his legislative assistant for 2.5 years and 4 provincial budgets. And I went consulting after that. But that was my life in politics. A couple of years in Parliament Hill, 2 or 3 years at Queen's Park.
Well, let's talk about the next step then. You said you went consulting. What exactly did you do, and with whom? And
Yeah, I didn't know what I wanted to do, and I thought a good way to give me sort of a panoramic view of the job market would be to join a public affairs consulting agency. And I joined the biggest one at the time, called Public Affairs International and Decima Research. They were sister companies. And a couple of years later, they merged with Hill & Knowlton to become Hill & Knowlton Canada. And Hill & Knowlton is one of the big multinational New York-based PR agency. So I worked in the Toronto office of Hill & Knowlton. Did that for 8 years, finished my 8 years with a year as president of Berger and Associates, which was a Hill & Knowlton subsidiary. Did that for a year, and then we started our own company in '95.
Terry, it's of interest to me, and I think our audience would share in this interest. Many people in the consulting industry around the political field use their contacts and use their influence and open doors for people, and that's really the service that they provide.
Right.
I greatly respect that that was not the way that you and your colleagues approached. Can you just explain what your philosophy was?
Sure, I'm happy to. And it wasn't even the whole company. It was our unit, the Queen's Park unit, and it was really my boss at the time. He became my partner in business. But we decided we did not want to be that. I mean, lobbyists had a sort of a pejorative ring to it.
Yeah.
Greasing wheels, greasing palms, Rolodex mongering. I was not interested in calling up people I'd worked with at Queen's Park and saying, can you help out my client on this?
Yeah.
You know, that's not what I was interested in doing. So we adopted a different approach to government affairs, public affairs consulting, which really relied on what we knew rather than who we knew. And an understanding of how government works, the pressure points in the decision-making process, and above all, the need for clients to develop a sound public policy position to advance, to give the government a solution if they weren't happy with something the government was doing. So what it meant was that I still had a job in that field when the NDP swept to power and Bob Rae became premier. Many other government affairs consultants lost their jobs because they had tied themselves to their own party. And we tied ourselves to an understanding of government and politics.
Good for you. Now, you and your boss, Joe Thornley, then started your own firm.
We started Thornley Fallis in '95, and we started not as a government affairs, public affairs firm, but more as a straight-up communications agency, largely because we were both married to women who were senior civil servants. And if you're a government affairs consultant and your spouse is a senior civil servant, that's not a good thing for either of your careers.
Right.
So we hands-off government affairs work, and we did straight communications. And so we were very lucky. We got out of the gate really strong. We landed Molson. We were Molson's national agency of record for 9 years. We did Nike, we did Universal Studios, we did Travelocity, we did Allstate. We did lots of big companies, and we grew to be about 40 people in 2 offices, which was, you know, I wasn't always comfortable. I'm not a natural entrepreneur. Had I not had a partner, I'm not sure I could have done it. But it was a great experience for me, and not to jump too far ahead, but that agency is still in operation now, still called Thornley Fallis Communications, though I retired March the 1st so I could write full-time.
This year. Yeah.
Something I've wanted to do since 2008 when my first novel came out. But
Well, let's talk about that writing career. I think there's probably 1 or 2 people here would be interested in that aspect of your life. And here's what I'd like to do if you'll humor me through this. I'd like to talk about each of the books because I think the process, and we'll talk more about process, if you will, after this, but I'd like to go through each of the 8 books and sort of ask you to tell me a synopsis of the plot, how it got published or didn't get published in one case, and what success it had. Is that fair? So let's start with Best Laid Plans,
yes.
which was a huge success right out of the gate. Tell us what the plot is.
Wasn't actually a huge success out of the gate, but we'll come to
Well,
that.
I know.
That's his setup. You thought that. That's good part of that. The plot was, well, no one in their right mind who wanted to be published in Canada would have chosen to write a satirical novel of Canadian politics. It just is not something that would be greeted warmly by publishers, and we'll come to that. But I didn't know that. I was naive. I just thought I needed to write about something that I understood, something that I knew about, something that I cared about. I do think of it as satire. My goal was not just to make people laugh through it, but it was to make them think about some of the challenges we face in politics, some of the problems, and perhaps to illuminate a path that we might take that would put us on a better course in politics. And I embodied that approach in the character of Angus McClintock, my accidental MP.
Mm-hmm.
I made him a mechanical engineering professor. I wonder why I did that.
Where did that come from?
I know a fair bit about mechanical engineering and mechanical engineering professors. I made him a grammarian. Thank you. That's owed to my father. So I tend to plumb the depths of my own experiences and write about things that I know, because as a writer, we're striving for authenticity. We're trying to write with authority and conviction and to make our readers believe it. And if I'd never been in the back rooms on Parliament Hill, it's hard to write a novel and have that come across in a way that is believable.
Right. Now, is Daniel Addison really Terry Fallis?
No, I don't think so. There are plenty of autobiographical elements in the novel, but I don't think of it as autobiographical. It's not an autobiographical story. I think probably there's some of Angus in me, the engineer in Angus is me. So I'm kind of split between the two characters. The one concession I might make to autobiography is simply that I think it's easiest for writers to write in their own voice. If you want to be authentic, you write in your own voice, even though you're not the character. So most of my narrators, if you were to read all of my books in quick succession, you would say, all those narrators sound quite a bit alike. That's because they sound quite a bit like me. But I am not the narrator.
No.
That's how I sort of describe that.
Right. So with this well-written novel, you went to market, and how did that go?
I went to market, yes. I sent out dozens and dozens and dozens of plot synopses, sample chapters, and query letters to literary agents and publishers in Canada and into the United States. And then, Fred, I sat back and I waited for the feeding frenzy to ensue over my debut blockbuster novel. And I waited and diligently followed up, and the feeding frenzy seemed to be taking quite some time to get started. After a year, do you know how many rejection letters I had received after a year of doing that and diligently following up?
No.
0.
Oh, they all accepted it.
Yeah, right, I wish. I didn't make a big enough impression on the traditional publishing establishment to generate an automated rejection letter. Which is the clearest evidence now of what I should have known before, is that you don't write a satirical novel of Canadian politics if you expect to be published. After doing that for a year and with no evidence to suggest that anything would change were I to continue those efforts, my wife said, why don't you just self-publish it just to be done with it?
Get it out of the way.
And I did. I self-published it. While it was being self-published, before it was out, we were still working on editing and the cover design and all of that. I podcast the entire novel chapter by chapter, the audio version of the novel, and released it for free on iTunes. Just because I knew I needed to build an audience for this book, because I didn't have a publisher. So I did that, and I'm not sure I would have completed the self-publishing process were it not for the really positive response I got from listeners, strangely enough, around the world, who somehow stumbled upon it and would email me. And a lot of people have mistakenly said, you must have had such faith in your story to do that. That wasn't it at all, Fred. I wanted to know whether I'd written a novel. I honestly didn't know whether I didn't know whether the story held together, whether the characters were believable, whether it was funny. I just had this faint inkling that it was finished. And I didn't believe my wife and my sister-in-law and my brother, who loved the novel, because they loved me.
Mm-hmm.
And was I getting objective feedback? But the person living in Kuala Lumpur who complained about having to wait a week before the next chapter was uploaded, I believed them. They had no stake in my well-being. So it was the positive feedback from my podcast listeners in different parts of the world and in Canada that gave me the wherewithal or the resolve to hit the big red button and self-publish it. And that's what happened.
Terry, we had a guest on this stage who, and it would have been probably 2015 or 16, who wrote a book and sent it to 27 publishers. And he got 28 rejections. It's a true story.
It's not an uncommon story.
One of the publishers obviously didn't know they'd already rejected him and rejected him again. And his story's not unlike yours. He circulated a manuscript to friends, and the friends had faith in him and told him he should self-publish. So he ended up self-publishing, and then, like you, got a publisher. That little book called The Shack, written by William Paul Young, has now sold 25 million copies. It is the 50th most read book in the history of the world.
It's an astonishing story.
Yeah, I mean, and your story just parallels it.
I wish he hadn't spoken before me, because it is a great story, and I know that story well. And people sometimes put me in the same sentence, not in a book sale perspective, but in that sometimes self-published novels do somehow, through some twist of fate or moment of serendipity or a lightning strike, it turns into something.
Well, for you, it was
It was
self-publishing and seeking an award. Who does that?
Who does that? Exactly. Well, I had just come back. I had a book launch at McMaster University, our alma mater. The bookstore manager stumbled upon it in the book catalogs and called and said, "Why don't we do a book launch here?" And I still had lots of friends and colleagues and contacts at Mac. So I was thrilled. I mean, that's what real authors get, a bookstore launch. So I went down, and there was a table with 3 pens on it, as if I was, in case I ran out of ink on all the signing I was going to do. I had 2 extras. And there were a big pile of my books there. Well, there were about 12 of my books there. But that for a self-published author, 12 is a big pile. And I talked about the novel. I thanked people. I did a reading, and both people who came bought books. but I was thrilled. I was in a bookstore, and I had a book signing. And I got back to my office the next day, and when you self-publish, they send you an author package. I had a box of 10 books that had arrived for me.
Oh.
They were, at the time, they were the only 10 copies in existence, because it's all print on demand. Someone orders it, they spit out a single copy and send it to them. So I had the first 10 copies, I had them in the box under my desk. And I thought, what am I going to do with these? Flush from my triumphant book signing at McMaster. And I just on a lark, I swear to you it was a lark, I went to the website of the Stephen Leacock Memorial Medal for Humor, one of our oldest literary awards in the country. And some of you may know, but many of you may not, that almost every major literary award in this country and every other country explicitly excludes self-published works from consideration. You cannot send your self-published novel into the Giller Prize or the Governor General's Award. They're not eligible. So I checked the eligibility requirements on the Leacock website. No such restriction. Clearly an oversight on their part. They said they needed a headshot of the author. I had one on my computer. I printed it out. They needed a check for $100 from the publisher, the entry fee. I was the publisher.
Yeah.
And they needed 10 copies. And I know this will sound hyperbolic, but I swear it is true. Had they required 11 copies or 12, as many other awards do, you would be introducing and interviewing somebody else here tonight, Fred, because I think my literary life would have been stillborn. Frankly, had I not had a cardboard box that they were sitting in, that would have thwarted the whole enterprise as well. But I had everything I needed, and I put a postage on the box from our postage meter at the office. I put it at the receptionist's desk, went back to my office, and then I got cold feet. I said, "You can't send your self-published novel into the Leacock Medal. Are you crazy?" I mean, Robertson Davies won that, and Mordecai Richler, and W.O. Mitchell. So I went back, I went to pull the box back, and it had left. And I said, when did the guy come? About 5 minutes ago. I ran down the stairs, and I watched as the Canada Post truck did a U-turn on Yonge Street and drove north. And that was it. Not to belabor the story, because I can talk for an hour about that experience, but you can check the website I check the website like every 20 minutes or so to see who was in the running, and eventually, I was shortlisted, which was the shock of my life, and then it won. A self-published novel won the Leacock Medal. Oh, I love that headline. I'm so glad that you have that. Because that is, I mean, I landed a literary agent on the strength of being shortlisted, and she said to me, and I'm still with her all these years later, she said, Terry, I mean, she said, give me your hands. And we were at a bar at the Four Seasons Hotel. The first time I'd met her, she agreed to take me on the strength of being shortlisted. She said, before we get started, give me your hands. And I thought this was sort of an odd request, but I was so thrilled to be in the same building with the literary agent, I would have given her a foot rub if she'd had it. So I gave her my hands, and she took my hands, and she said, look me in the eye. I looked her in the eye, and she said, Terry, you're not going to win the Leacock Medal. I said, Beverly, I'm still in shock from being shortlisted. I'm under no illusion that I'm going to win. She goes, good. And she was doing the right thing and just managing my expectations. And then my name was called from the podium, so I had a stroke. But
You were
I still
floored.
carry in my wallet. I bet I could find it if I look. But in my wallet, the business card where I wrote a few points in the parking lot, just in case I happen to win. Sorry, this is a bit unplanned. Clearly, it's unplanned. It's in here somewhere. Okay. I'll find it later.
Well, we'll just look at, these are some pictures taken at the present.
Oh yeah, that was the, yeah.
So what were the points? Do you remember them?
Oh, I remember giving thanks. Oh, I
Good.
thanked everybody I could think of, but I remember giving thanks to Dave and Morley
Yes, good.
for having a particularly uneventful year. Because Stuart McLean did not have a book out that year.
Oh, good.
Or I suspect I would not have won. No, but I don't remember everything I said, but I was really bowled over. I think my last line was, if you see me curled in the fetal position, breathing into a paper bag, just go on about your business and know that I'm coming to grips with this head-on collision of shock and joy.
Oh, beautiful line.
Yeah, I don't know why I remember. Actually, I do know why I remember it, because it was a big moment.
Yeah.
It was a moment that changed my life as a writer.
Huge, yeah. Now, if the Leacock Award wasn't enough, that same book was recognized by Canada Reads as the essential Canadian novel of the decade.
Yeah, a ridiculous notion, but that is what they attach to the winner of Canada Reads. I mean, if another book had won, they would have been the essential Canadian. But yes, it was. It did win Canada Reads in 2011, which was an extraordinary blessing for a writer with his first novel. Well, for any writer, but Canada Reads sells more books in this country than anything else.
Yeah.
Except for the Giller Prize. The Giller Prize outdoes it just slightly, but I mean, the Best Laid Plans had sold about 10,000 copies in the 3 years between its hitting the market and Canada Reads, and it's now sold about 150,000 copies. And that's the Canada Reads effect, which is no joke. That white Canada Reads imprimatur, the badge on the front of the novel, it almost doesn't matter what's in between the cover.
It's a must-read.
It will sell.
Yeah.
And so I think of the Leacock Medal as what made me a writer, because I went into that Leacock Awards ceremony feeling like a weekend scribbler, and I came out feeling like a writer.
Yeah.
And Canada Reads made me a bestseller, and has really...
I'll just mention to you quickly that citation, Essential Canadian Novel of the Decade, reminded me of the number of people that talk about writing the great Canadian novel. And I mentioned that to my wife a couple of nights ago. I said, you know, it's amazing how many people say they're going to write the great Canadian novel. And she said, you told me you were when I first met you.
I know
it hasn't happened, Terry, and it won't. So let's move to the adaptation by CBC.
Sure. That was such a fun experience. It was a 6-part television miniseries on CBC, and I had just a peripheral involvement. They usually don't want the writer of the novel to be that close to the production, because often they are jealous about, they want to protect their story. I wasn't like that at all. I was 45 when I wrote my first novel. I've had some more, I hope, experience in the world, and I knew that the novel was not going to be the same when it hit the screen. It just can't be. There are too many factors and variables. But I was thrilled that Susan Coyne and Jason Sherman, two of our finest writers in Canada, TV writers, wrote the script. I got to review the scripts, and I commented on the scripts. I didn't comment when the script departed from the story, because they have written a check, a very small check in Canada, just so you know, for the film rights.
Right.
And so it's their story. It was no place of mine to question the story. I only questioned when I thought the characters were doing things that were out of keeping with their character.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
And each time I did that, which wasn't many times, like 2 or 3 times, each time they respected and reflected those comments in the next iteration of the script.
It's good.
And I was on the set for...
there's a picture of you
on
the set.
Yeah, actually that was at the CBC launch.
Oh, okay.
That was a real shock to come in. I mean, it's bad enough seeing your picture on a poster in front of the Midland Community Cultural Centre, but to walk into CBC and it was that big, that picture of my face.
Now this is you on the set with the Prime Minister.
Yes, that's with Mark McKinney from Saturday Night Live and Kids in the Hall. He was the Prime Minister. And you'll see I'm wearing a lapel pin there. That's because I was in that episode. That was my cameo.
Oh, wow.
I was a newly elected member of Parliament. I didn't know they were doing that. The director called me and said, "Can you come to Ottawa for one more time, one more day on the shoot?" And I said, "Well, sure." And said, "And bring a suit." And I was kind of in awe of him, so I didn't even ask why. I said, "Okay, I'll bring in a suit." And I thought we were going to meet somebody, and instead they had me wear the suit, and I was into makeup, and I was in the show. Now, if you sneezed at the wrong moment in the show, or went to the kitchen for a drink, you probably would have missed it. And my phone was not ringing off the hook for auditions thereafter, but it was really fun and quite special to be in the episode.
Yeah. It also was made into a stage musical on the West Coast. And I'm going to move on because we still have 7 novels to go.
Exactly. I'll be faster. I knew this would happen.
So, second novel, The High Road, picks up where Best Laid Plans.
This can be fast.
Yes.
It was a sequel. I just thought, it ain't broke, don't fix it. So I wrote a sequel picking up, and I left the door open at the end of the first novel, just in case I might wish the opportunity to continue the story. And I did, and it was lots of fun. There's lots of hijinks. There's some Canada-U.S. relations in that one. There's a showdown at the cabinet table between the finance minister and Angus, and there's the collapse of the Alexandra Bridge in the novel, which joins Ottawa to Hull, and strangely enough, 10 years after now, or 11 years after, they are now tearing down the Alexandra Bridge to replace it because it is not viable anymore.
Oh, isn't that fun?
I took advantage of that and made it collapse in my novel, so I hope I'm not responsible for what has happened down there.
You also introduced a dirty tactics opponent for Angus in that.
I did. I was again showcasing some of the nastier side of politics, which was my way of saying, let's get rid of this.
Yeah.
And that was kind of fun. I think his name was Emerson the Flamethrower Fox.
Yeah. Good for you.
Lots of fun.
Let's talk about Up and Down, because it's a departure from the political realm.
Up and Down was an important novel for me. It was my 3rd novel, and I decided I didn't want to write another in the Angus series. I wanted to see whether I could write something other than political satire. So I wrote this novel that brought together a couple of aspects of my life. Again, not autobiographical, but I've had a fascination with the space program since I was 9 years old and watched Neil Armstrong step onto the surface of the moon. And I also spent 8 years working in the Toronto office of a multinational PR agency, as we earlier discussed. So in this novel, the narrator David Stewart, is a newly minted PR professional at the Toronto office of a multinational PR agency.
Yeah.
And their client is NASA. And they're trying to rekindle public interest in the space program, which is a real premise, a true premise that NASA needed to do that because Congress was shutting the tap off. Dramatically. So they figured if we want the public to become more interested in space, we need to put the public in space. So the idea for the Citizen Astronaut Lottery came out of the brain of the narrator, David Stewart. And who becomes the Canadian winner and what unfolds thereafter is the story. And it was lots of fun.
And that, I think you told me that's your favorite novel, personally.
If you were to force me to tell you the Best Laid Plans will always have a special place, given where it was what it did in my career. But as for the story, I love that story and the characters in it. And who knows, maybe I'll return to those characters at some point. But I had a lot of fun with that, and it was issues and ideas that were close to me, too.
And it debuted on the Globe and Mail bestseller list, and it won the 2013 Leacock Medal.
That was shortlisted for the Leacock Medal. It didn't win the Leacock Medal.
Finalist.
It was a finalist. It won the
Ontario Library Association
Evergreen Award, yes, which was a great thrill.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
And it was optioned for film as well for a year and didn't make it across the finish line, as happens with 95% of any book trying to make it to the screen.
I should share with our audience here, and also our audience will be watching this on replay, that you have a blog in which you have now begun to talk about the way your books came about. And the first book was this one that you talked about.
Yeah, I have it's called a Substack newsletter. Substack is the platform, but it's a newsletter, and if you go on my website, terryfallis.com, the first pinned blog post you will see will be an invitation for you to. It's free. It doesn't cost anything. You just have to give your email address, and I write one post a week, which reminds me I have to write one tomorrow. They come out on Sunday.
Well, I commend it. I do read it.
I've had fun doing it. It's relatively new. I think I have like 12 or 13 posts up there now. So.
It's great. Book number 4, No Relation. Really quick capsule.
Really quick. I once had a meeting with a lawyer when I was in my consulting capacity, a labor lawyer in Toronto, and I didn't know his name till I got there, and he introduced himself, said, "Hi, I'm Brian Mulroney." It was not that Brian Mulroney.
Yeah,
he was Prime Minister at the time.
Yeah.
This was another guy named Brian Mulroney. I thought, oh, this poor guy. And Brian Mulroney was at the nadir of his public popularity at the time. And I thought, this poor guy can't go to a neighborhood barbecue without someone cracking a joke about his name.
Yeah.
And this idea stuck in my head. And 20 years later came No Relation, which is the story of a struggling advertising agency writer whose name is Ernest Hemingway.
Spelled differently.
Spelled differently. Both Ernest and Hemingway are spelled differently.
Yeah.
But he has writer's block, and he thinks he's being haunted by the ghost of Ernest Hemingway because he doesn't like the way Hemingway writes. So anyway, he goes on the Ernest Hemingway World Exorcism Tour, visiting all of Hemingway's hotspots to confront his spirit almost.
Perfect.
And so it's a fun story.
And it won the 2015 Stephen Leacock.
I would have died happy winning the Leacock Medal once.
But you won it twice.
Winning it twice was
Wonderful.
A shock.
Poles Apart.
Poles Apart is my feminist comic novel. I mentioned earlier that gender equality was one of probably my chosen social cause, which I was turned on to in university when we brought a rather prominent feminist up to speak to the students at McMaster. And I was transfixed and went on a reading binge. I read my way through the feminist canon. My wife is an ardent feminist. We tried to raise our sons with that in mind. And it was inevitable that I would one day write a novel about it. You can see it lurking in the undergrowth of my first 2 novels. Angus McClintock's departed spouse was a feminist scholar.
To whom he writes even after she's gone.
That's right. So Poles Apart is about a young man who is a feminist who writes a feminist blog that becomes the toast of the internet. An Oprah Winfrey-like character stumbles upon it and promotes it on the show, and it blows up. And it's an anonymous blog because he doesn't think a man ought to be seen on the forefront of the feminist movement. So it's how he navigates writing the most popular feminist blog in the world anonymously while being outed by the strip club owner. And he lives in the apartment above the strip club, and the dancing pole actually attaches underneath the narrator's kitchen table. And he writes his best prose when his feet are being vibrated by the pole. That's when he writes his most inspired feminist rants. I'm very fond of that novel.
And it also opened on the Globe and Mail bestsellers list, and it was shortlisted finalists for Leacock as well.
Correct.
One Brother Shy. We get back to engineering here, don't we?
I'm trying to think. No, I don't think so.
I thought he was a shy software engineer.
You're right. You're right. He is a software engineer. You're quite right. I'm an identical twin, as I've mentioned. So I'd never written about twins. So this is a novel about identical twins who were separated at birth. And the narrator discovers this by finding half of a photograph and then finding the entire photograph in his mother's safety deposit box after she dies. He knows nothing about his brother. He works for a facial recognition software company. He uses his own face to search the internet and to find his identical twin brother. Wow. He doesn't know he has that identical twin brother. So, and there's a traumatic bullying episode that he's recovering from. And I was never bullied, but it's a big issue, online bullying. Yeah. So anyway, I had a lot of fun with that, and I know what it's like to be an identical twin, so I wrote about it.
Beautiful. And it was a #1 bestseller, as have been 5 of your novels?
Yes.
Wow. Well done.
Very lucky. Very lucky.
Now, Albatross. Very different plot.
Quite different. Albatross, many people think it's a story about golf. To me, it's not a story about golf. It's a story about the tension that exists between success and happiness. And it's something that many people feel. They succeed in their job. They're doing really well. They get promoted. They get headhunted. They get raises. And they realize, gee, I'm really good at this. But they're not getting up every morning going, I can hardly wait to get into the office. Yeah. So they get the golden handcuffs. They're doing this job really well. It's just not their life's calling. And I wanted to create a story that would allow readers to examine that issue. So I created this 17-year-old golfing phenom who has no control over how good he is in golf. It's just his body. Because mind means nothing in the game of golf. And he really wants to be a writer.
And it's interesting, he takes no credit for any of the successes he had, and he has all the successes that golf offers. Yeah. Albatross. So we just talked about Albatross. The last one, Operation Angus. Now I must tell you, I listened to this on audio.
Right.
And you did the voices.
I did the voice, yeah.
And it's really well done.
Well, I'm glad you think that. Thank you. Well, I've done it. I've podcast my first 6 novels. They're all available for free on iTunes. If you suffer with insomnia and wish to remedy that, you can hear me read you any of my first 6 novels. But Penguin Random House, McClellan Stewart, my publisher, they started their own audiobook division a few years ago. So my last 2 books, Albatross and Operation Angus, I've been official audiobooks they have to pay for. And I do the voice on it, though. So it was lots of fun to do that.
Good for you. Now, what I would like to do now, and our time is limited.
I'm sure.
And I'm really anxious to delve into what it is to be an author. So I want to begin by talking about inspiration. What do you draw on as your inspiration for the characters, for the plots in your book?
Well, I tend to write novels. In a way, people think, you write for a certain group of readers. No, I write for me. I write a novel that I want to read, and I hope that it happens to connect with others. But the safety in doing that is that I'm always interested in the novels that I'm writing, because I'm not latching on to the latest marketing trend, not writing a vampire novel because they're hot. I don't like vampire, don't know anything about them. So all of my novels feature something that I'm really keenly interested in. Politics and government, feminism, family, whatever else.
Relations, yeah.
Yeah, public relations, space program. So I do write for me. So I'm inspired by things that I care about. I've never written about music, for instance, though I've been a closeted singer-songwriter since I was 17 years old. But that's part of what's going into my next novel. So I'm sort of checking off things that I know about. Again, not autobiographical, but I know about that world.
It is interesting to see some of your interests reflect themselves. When I was reading Albatross, I was fascinated by the detail about fountain pens. Like, who knows that much about fountain pens?
Yeah, I've been a fountain pen aficionado, not for that long, maybe 5 or 6 years, and I have a small collection. You may not think it's small, but believe me, it's small relative to others. I have about 15 or 16 nice fountain pens that I have working just the way I like them. So none of that was, it's not essential to the story, but it adds texture and flavor and color.
That's right.
And no research was required. Another benefit for me.
Perfect. I want to move next to the writing process. So where do you start?
Well, I start with an idea. And for instance, on my One Brother Shy novel, I knew I wanted to write something about identical twins, but I had no idea what the story would be. So I start with that premise of identical twins. And eventually I just carry that notion around in my head, and ideas start to emerge. And the idea of twins separated at birth, which is not a new idea, but I thought I could do it in a new way. And that it just started to evolve from there.
Now, what drives the story? Is it the storyline, or is it the moral message that you're trying to get across?
That's a good question. I think there's maybe equal parts, not to evade the question. But story is really important. If you can't keep the reader interested and make them want to turn the page, you can proselytize all you want, and people will not make it to the end of the book. So if I do have a message in these novels, I always endeavor to cloak it in a story. And so a certain portion of the readers may not even get to the underlying story. And I'm fine with that. It's their, when they pick it up, it's their novel then. It's their story. When I write it, it's mine. So that's what happens. I try to bring characters and story and some, usually, not always, but usually some kind of a message underneath that I want readers to think about, even subconsciously. And that sort of comes together.
I've heard authors say that the book writes itself and that they're surprised by the turns it takes.
Not I.
Okay.
No, I know those writers, and I believe them. It's true. Those are writers who start writing their manuscript without really knowing what the story is, and it reveals itself through their writing. I'm an engineer. I'm a planner, an extremely anally retentive planner. So if it takes me 14 months to write a novel, which is about what it takes, I'm not writing complete sentences. I'm not writing the manuscript until the last 2 or 3 months of the process. I spend the rest of the time cooking up the story first in my head, comes out in a timeline in a notebook with a pen, fountain pen.
Fountain pen, of course.
Then it's onto my computer, and I begin to blow it out. I have a chapter map. I start spacing things around. I know who does what to whom. Eventually, I write about an 85 to 95 page, chapter by chapter, bullet point version of the novel.
So you know where you're going before
The
you...
whole novel is essentially written in point form.
Right, right.
And then that 95-page bullet point outline sits on one side of my screen. My manuscript sits on the other side of the screen. And I've just finished the manuscript for my next novel, and I wrote it in about 8 weeks. Now, that seems fast. It's only fast because I spent a year getting to the point where I could write the story. All that stands before me and a finished manuscript is time, because I know the story cold by that stage. And that's what works for me.
I've always wondered whether authors think in terms of sentences, paragraphs, pages, chapters.
That's a good question.
What's the thought process?
For me, when I'm planning it out, I'm thinking in scenes.
Scenes.
I think of it as scenes. And I don't even know, I write them chronologically. Even that's how anally retentive I am. I can't sort of pick and choose, I think I'll write that scene today. No, I'm going straight through chronologically. And then at the end of that, I begin to figure out what chapters, whether this scene is in the end of chapter 4 or the beginning of chapter 5, that sort of thing.
Right.
And I like to write chapters that are about 5,000 words in length. That's about a half hour of reading. So my readers get accustomed to sort of a cadence in the novel, as opposed to writers who, like Daniel Silva, for instance, we talked about at dinner, who will write a 14-page chapter, then a 2-page chapter, then a 6-page chapter, and I find it harder to get into a rhythm. So you can rest assured that anywhere from 48 to 6,000 words, those are my chapters.
Okay. Now, another question, and I don't know whether anybody else thinks these things. How do you know when the book's done?
Well, the deadline comes around. No, it's... how I know is, and I don't ever know, like if you gave me, when I read an old novel of mine, which I've never done actually, but if I were to pick up my third novel and read it again, I would be making changes. Even when I finish a novel and it's published and I do readings, I'm editing the reading. The reading's not exactly sometimes what it says in the book. So it's never really done. But when I go through it 3 or 4 times and am only making tiny little changes that I probably shouldn't be making, then it feels like it's ready. And my editor will then say, it's ready.
Yeah.
And I say, okay.
I've been asked the question, how do you know when a contract is perfect? Like, when do you stop drafting it? And by the way, the process of learning to be a lawyer is not unlike the process of learning to be an engineer.
Agreed.
And I have said on occasion, I could spend the rest of my life drafting a 30-page contract.
Yeah.
And it would just get, I hope, better and better and better.
Right.
But I could just go on and on.
But the gradations of improvement become so fine.
Minuscule.
Yeah.
Yeah. Who has the final say on edits, on changes? Does the publisher, does the editor, does the author?
I don't specifically know the answer to that. What I can tell you is that my editor will often propose cuts. Like, I think we lost 10,000 words out of Operation Angus. And that's painful for the writer, because you labor over those words. But when I read the red swath of text on the track changes version in my Microsoft Word that she wants to cut out, or she wanted to cut out, I then understand why she wants to cut it out. So we have editors for a reason. They're very good at their job, and they make the book better. 98% of the edits that she proposed in that novel, I approved. The 1 or 2 I didn't quite like. I had a conversation with her. She totally understood why, and they stayed in. Does that mean I have final say? I don't think it necessarily does.
It's kind of a negotiation.
Yeah, I persuaded her that here's why I think that should stay in, and she agreed.
Let's turn, and we have very little time left, but I'm fascinated by what you're saying. Let's turn to the business of writing. At what point does an author decide to make it a career?
Well, it's very hard. Well, if by career you mean writing full-time, there are probably only, like relatively speaking, a handful of Canadian writers can write full-time, unless they're independently wealthy. Margaret Atwood would be one of them, and a number of others. But the economics of publishing in Canada, particularly if you really are only published in Canada, it's very hard. You can be at the top of the bestsellers list, and I luckily have been, and all 8 of my novels have been bestsellers, and yet I waited from 2008 until 4 months ago, I guess now, before I could stop working to become a writer full time. That's just the reality of the economics.
What kind of demands does a career in writing place on your life?
If you're going to do it in a way that most serves your readers and your book sales, writing the novel and getting it published is probably not even half the battle. Then you've got to go out and promote it. And I'm grateful to be sitting here. I'm grateful to you and to all of you because this gives me a chance to talk about my novels. And that's what helps sell novels. And I know we have Georgian Bay Books at the back, which is very kind of them to be here. Speaking about your novel is part of the job. And if you happen to be comfortable with it, which thank goodness I am, I quite enjoy it, many writers loathe this part of the business. But if you want to do more than have the spine of your book marketing itself in the bookstore as it sits there on the shelf, you won't sell very many copies. And there are far better books than mine that don't sell as many because they're not out there promoting them.
So this is an example of what you do. Did you tell me 140 times a year? Is that...
I think my high water mark, I forget what year it was, 2014 or something, I did 143 speaking engagements in the year. Usually it's at least over 100 until COVID hit, and then I did fewer, and all of them on Zoom. But that was better than not getting out at all.
Sure.
It's just part of the job, and I actually like meeting readers, so it's nice for me.
And you also occasionally meet other authors, and I have a picture here, and I can't imagine how thrilled this other author would be to be sitting beside you.
Yes. I'm probably sweating bullets in that picture. Yes, that's with Margaret Atwood, who's been very kind to me. She asked me to speak at an event for her bird observatory, the Pelee Island Bird Observatory in Windsor. And I got to spend the day with her. We had dinner and together, and she introduced me, and I spoke, and then we sat together to sign books. And if my life had ended that evening, that would have been fine with me.
Well, that's a great story. I want to talk to you a little bit about your family. Your wife, Nancy Naylor, has a fairly significant career of her own.
Yes, I married well above my station.
Didn't we all?
Yes. I married the smartest woman I know. She is a very accomplished senior civil servant in the Ontario government, 35 years in the Ontario government. She's the Deputy Minister of Education.
Wow.
Which is a very big job. We're like two ships that crash in the night sometimes. She's wonderful. And really, were I not married to her, I probably would not have been able to have retired in the beginning of March to spend my entire time focused on my novels now, which is a great blessing. So she is wonderful.
Now, does she like your books, Terry?
She claims to like them.
Yeah.
She does read them in manuscript form, and she's a very good editor. But to be honest, we don't have a lot of discussion about the story and what she loves. It's an interesting kind of relationship. My twin brother is also a very early reader, and I get more feedback from him. Right. And he often picks things up that I have missed and that my editor has missed.
Interesting. Now you have a couple of boys. Tell us about them.
2 sons, Calder and Ben. Calder is going to be 30 in August, so they're hardly boys anymore. He is followed in his mother's footsteps. He is doing quite well as an economist. He doesn't have an economics degree, but his business card says economist.
Okay.
Sort of a policy advisor in the Solicitor General, Ministry of the Solicitor General in Ontario. My younger son, Ben, who's 27, is a chef. He had a theater degree and hasn't acted yet, but he is a chef in a very high-end luxury kind of food store. And it's great to have a chef in the family.
Well, sounds like you have several.
Yes, that's true. Everyone cooks in the family, actually.
I'm sure there's somebody in this audience who would like to ask you, Terry, what do you read?
What do I read? When I'm writing my novels, I tend to read nonfiction. I don't like other novels and other characters to get in my head. So I'm often reading nonfiction books about Paris in the 1920s, that era of the expat writer. Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Morley Callahan, Ford Madox Ford, those types. I'm fascinated by that era. If I could go back in time, it would be to Paris in the 1920s. My wife and I go there every couple of years just to spend a week in Paris and in the left bank in the Latin Quarter where all of that unfolded. So I read biography, read other writers, and I'm often reading manuscripts of writers to give blurbs for them, as we call it in the business.
Right.
So I'm not very good at saying no when people ask me to give a blurb. And I don't even want to say no, because that people helped me when I started, and I like to be supportive of writers earlier in their career.
It's one thing that's almost a theme is the number of writers who can point to another writer who gave them encouragement at the key moment.
Very important.
Well, this has been fascinating. I've really enjoyed getting to know you, Terry. I mean, you and I spent 2.5 hours on the phone. I can't remember the last person I talked to for that long.
That was a sign that I was going to prattle on too much, and I probably did tonight. But
you've done
I'm grateful to be here.
Well.
It was wonderful. And what a great job that you do.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Great job.
I just want to extend some thanks as we wrap up. I want to thank our friends at Rogers TV who will record our program, and thanks to our producer tonight, Josh. Thanks to the MCC staff and our technician, Glenn Irwin. We certainly want to thank our season sponsors, Kathy Bales, Michelle Dishaw, and Jeff Holloway of RBC Dominion Securities. And thanks to you, Jeff, for being with us this evening. Thanks to our program sponsor, Greg Rice, who, by the way, was a former law partner of mine.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Talk about leaning on your friends.
Right,
yeah.
Exactly.
Thanks to our Day in the Life team. We have a group of people who get together the morning after these shows and tell me what I did wrong, so I always look forward to that. John Farragher, who's not well and isn't with us this evening, but we thank John for having been part of our team for a long time. Brian McKell is here. Lori Ann Clancy is in the building, but she's directing the play that is going on next door. Jen Parker, Doris Sloan, and Jonathan Wallace, so thanks to each of you. Terry, I really want to thank you. It's a real treat to meet an author whose work you have read and admired. Like, it's fun to get a look behind the scenes. So thank you for that. To those of you in our live audience here, we'll meet you in the atrium, or I guess actually at the back of the room here, Terry, and you'll sign some books. Thanks to each of you for being here. Thanks to those of you who are watching on TV. And Terry, thank you so much. Great evening.
Thank you, Fred. I really appreciate it. Thank you.